I must say that they had one big advantage over me because they had the benefit of voluminous biographies, which unfortunately I do not. Dr. Manmohan Singh never wrote his autobiography, and we don't yet have a biography. However, we do have a book strictly personal, Manmohan and Bouchard, by his daughter, Daman Singh. Now, this is primarily a personal family memoir, but it includes many conversations between father and daughter in which he comments on issues of current importance, which is really, I found, very useful in preparing this lecture. I had often urged him to write his own memoirs, but he was absolutely adamant in refusing. And I'm sure that students of history and current events will find Daman's book a great help because it will give them an insight into what Dr. Manmohan Singh thought as communicated by him directly to his daughter. I should, of course, add that I think Nippy has already, I don't know if you mind my lawyer, Nippy, Vipendra Mishra ji had already mentioned. We have a very long association as colleagues, but I think the most interesting one I must record is, when we were about to move out, we lived for 10 years in 32, now Abdul Kalam Mark, and he lived earlier to the Army Group. And my late wife, Disha, had walked the rock and making that house really good. And she said, you must move out within 30 days because I don't want to delay. But I'm just concerned that this house should, as she put it, go to a good family. So she asked me to call up and say, look, what would you, since you're principal secretary, ask for the house, then it will have gone to a good family. And he did that thing. We were successive occupants of the same house. That's just a personal diversion. I've known Dr. Manmohan Singh, as he said, for a very long time. He was both a mentor and also a role model for me. He encouraged me to return to India in 1979. And I had the privilege of being part of his team when he was finance minister. And later, when he became prime minister, he asked me to come back from Washington, where I'd gone for a brief assignment with the IMF to be the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. So, there's a close association, but I do realize that this makes it more difficult for me to be an independent observer. So I want to declare that prejudice out in front. I hope I will try to be as objective as possible. First, he had three big parts in his life. So the early part, which is of course, right? Then as a civil servant, then he got his finance minister, then his prime minister. I can't possibly cover all of this in years details. That would require a book. But I touch on each of those. Now, as far as his early life is concerned, I've always found it impressive when he say, quote, the child is the father of man. Because it gives you a sense from a person's childhood. What were the dominant influences there? And we know that Manmohan Singh was born in a village in a frequently drought-stricken part, pre-partition, pre-independence Punjab, which is now in Pakistan. His mother died when he was very, very young, and he was brought up by his maternal grandparents for the first 9 years of his life. Both his maternal grandparents were Egyptian. That tells you the background in which he came. Daman's book tells us that they lived in an urban house, a mud cake house, if you like, with only 2 rooms, one for sleeping, on the other for everything else. And their possessions, etc., were all there. And she adds, and I quote, slaves had a nasty habit of creeping in, and young Manmohan enjoyed watching his normally uncoupled grandmother running out of the house in Paris. She adds that he would accompany her grandmother to the Gurdwara even as early as 4 in the morning. That before the age of 11. So on the age of 9 was really pretty impressive. While the family had no exposure to politics, except, Manmohan Singh's father, Montek Singh, at the relatively young age of 14, joined the Jetto Morcha, which was launched at that time, somewhere around 1928, to protest the removal by the British of Maharaja Manmohan Singh of Nama. And he was removed because he was protesting the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh by wearing a black turban. That's all he did. But I think the Raj friends, this was not good manners, and so he was deposed from his death. So, in order to show some solidarity with this morcha, and Manmohan's father, at the young age of 14, took part in this morcha and was sent to jail. So, he spent some time in Naba jail. Many other people have also been there during the independence movement. And she says that he was sentenced to hard labor, which actually involved cooking. But a residual advantage, she says, is that as a result, he became quite a good cook. And his cooking was much appreciated by the family as a result. That's a charming sort of vignette, if you like. Now, obviously, partition was a terrible trauma for the family, as it was for millions of others. And the immediate family was able to move to India safely. And there were some relatives to the terrible bloodletting that took place at the time. Despite this personal experience, this is, I think, quite important. Manmohan Singh never succumbed to bitterness and hate. He always hoped that it would be possible for India and Pakistan to move to a more normal relationship. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened, but certainly that was the hope. And from this very humble beginning, he worked hard and excelled academically, graduating at the top of his class in economics from Punjab University. And I think Rishadi had also already mentioned that he went to Cambridge and then went to Oxford, came back, taught, became a professor in the Delhi School of Economics. This was a distinguished career, and as I had mentioned, it was the start of a career, a very brief career in academics, followed by a civil servant, finance minister, and prime minister. So let me then talk about these parts individually. I should mention, by the way, I'm more than a little nervous on this occasion because I normally do not read from a speech. But the organizers have told me that this becomes part of a ringo. So this is a very heavy burden. To be part of a 5 minute stereo record. You can't junk the thing, whatever you like. But they persuaded me, like, the part of the text here and there, the written text would be there, so I'm really using it as a base. He was most, I can certify that this is my impression. He was most relaxed when surrounded by books. And I think he missed the joys of academic discussion and the free exchange of views. He recognized that the world was actually much too complex for simplistic conclusions. He was fond of saying that India is a diverse and complex society in which everything said about India is true, but the opposite is also true. This has been quoted many times. And as an economist, he always welcomed his own views. He challenged, actually even enjoyed. This is a typical academic trait because you enjoy the challenge. Usually people in government do not enjoy the challenge. In fact, they take it rather rude. But I think later on, even when he was finance minister, prime minister, and I think he also hinted that was so, he was quite willing to look at people putting forward different views, and he had a look. I should add where people believe that the state had an important role to play. The left gave it an all-encompassing role,
But others, except for a very few market fundamentalists, viewed it as having an essential and active role. So exactly what that role should be varied quite a bit. He was not a free market fundamentalist. I think his own early experience of life had made him powerfully aware that a great deal needed to be done to give the poor in rural areas a fair chance of realizing their potential. Now, I'm sorry, I wasn't able to do what I should have done. I just put it off. Um, I'll just suppress it. uh, at the same time, he was not afraid to question what were currently popular theories of development. His doctoral thesis in Oxford, India's export performance and prospects, challenged the export pessimism that was widely shared in the developing world at that time. This pessimistic view held that exports of developing countries were being constrained by unfavorable terms of trade and discriminatory practices followed by developed countries. There was some truth in that, but his point was that India's exports are not affected by that. Our exports will be held back by bad domestic policies at home. And he said that we were not doing enough to support our own supply base. We're not doing enough to build a proper infrastructure. And in that book, he also said that we were maintaining too strong an exchange rate. Shifting to a more depreciated exchange rate would be a good thing for our exports. And this has been a theme continuously since then. I think all this was an early indication of the fresh thinking he was trying to bring to Indian economic policy, which he managed to do in the rest of his career over a long period. So let me now talk about him as a civil servant. His civil service career, you could call it a dream long, just from a civil service point of view. And he joined in 1971 in the Commerce Ministry as economic advisor, quickly moved to the Finance Ministry as chief economic advisor. A couple of years later, he became Secretary Economic Affairs. Then he moved as member secretary planning permission. Then he became governor of the Reserve Bank. And then in 1985, I think he became deputy chairman of the planning commission. Pretty much all the important jobs in government were held by him in a pretty short period of approximately 60 years. Any civil servant would love to have that experience. But the interesting thing is that it is never easy to judge. I mean, you can read a CV and see that you're getting promoted. But the question you have to ask for a civil servant is, what do you achieve? And I think that's a very difficult question to answer for very good reasons. Because, a civil servant is meant to be a cog in the wheel. I mean, his job is to implement what the political masters do, and of course to advise them. But, they don't take his advice. It's his job to actually implement whatever they do. So, in a way, you can say that it becomes difficult. That's why I wish he had written his memoirs. But thanks to Daman's book, and maybe one recollection that I have, I can point out that he did actually make a significant contribution in the evolution of policy. Daman points out that he actually pushed for liberalization long before he became its public space. And many people commenting on the voicing liberalization, but I mean, a university at what is wonderful, etc. And also people would say, but what was he doing earlier? Because he was in Brahman for such a long time. I think the story tells you that he wasn't not speaking. He was speaking. I mean, after the Bangladesh War in 1972, must be in 72, P.N. Haksar, who was then the principal secretary to the Prime Minister, asked Manmohan to write a paper. What should we do with a picture? It's a reasonable pay because 71 was an incredible event. For the next 2 year, or even a year and a half, we were worrying about what to do with refugees, etc. But Akshay wanted to know, okay, now that it's all over, where right on top in Bhatwaji described Indira Gandhi at that time as Durga. So what should Durga do once the initial stuff is over? Manmohan Singh wrote a paper which unfortunately doesn't seem to exist. And it Daban says she's not in his list of papers, it must be somewhere. So if there are some discrete students around, I urge you to maybe look at the Prime Minister Memorial Library, look at Bhattacharya papers, whatever it is, dig it out. What he said is that we should now liberalize import policy and industry policy. So in 1971, he said it, he didn't just say it over a cup of coffee with some friends. He wrote a paper which he sent to P.N. Aksar, who I think most people would agree was a very, very strong principal secretary to the Prime Minister. So I think he had done his best. Of course, I don't know what happened to that paper, and that's where I wish more people. I mean, Akhtar Saab had written his own memoirs. Very strong case for all civil servants to write their memoirs. And I think a very strong case for all politicians' daughters to talk to their fathers to learn what was really going on and put it down. But there it was, an early recommendation, in my view, of the right kind. I used to meet him very often in the 1970s, and I know for a fact that this was indeed his view. Being a very gentle person is not a view that you had parade around, push, etc. But anyone probing him would find out that yes, that's what he thinks needs to be done. Let me give you one other example, because otherwise there won't be enough time. One other example of how he acted in his civil service days. And this really relates, goes back, I think in 1983, he was by then governor of the Reserve Bank of India. And you know, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International was a very well-known, high-profile, Dubai-based bank. It was expanding rapidly in the US, it was expanding rapidly in the UK. But you know, in India, it had only been given permission to run a, what you might call a representative office. They were not given permission to operate as a full-fledged bank branch, taking deposits from the public. And I think this was because the RBI had some suspicions that the bank was a bit shady and engaged in financing all sorts of, I don't know, drug smuggling, that kind of. I mean, these are all suspicion, but that was certainly true. That's why they're not being dealt now. Oh, it turned out they lobbied very hard. And I can understand that, you know, many people thinking that, no, the world is changing, we must open up, etc. But they said, why not? These fellows are expanding in the UK, they're expanding in the US, that sounds quite good. Dr. Manmohan Singh was very clear at this time, and indeed, nor was the rest of the RBI. And I think BCCI was able to lobby and persuade the finance ministry to move a cabinet note, which wouldn't make a decision on BCCI. It would just shift the permission for opening bank branches from the RBI to the finance ministry. Now, the case for doing that is a separate part. I won't go into that. But Dr. Singh's view was that this would weaken the RBI as an institution. And he took a very strong stand. He took the matter up with both the finance minister and the prime minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and said this will weaken the Reserve Bank as an institution. And if this is done, I will just have to resign. Very tough stand for a mere civil servant to take. And I mean, it's to the credit of Mrs. Gandhi that when she read all this and saw it, she said, "We right," and she stopped the move that was afoot. The change was on. Very clear case of intervention, which in my view, institutionally made a big difference. You know, you are hearing all the time in the world
that institutions are important. In fact, all the time in the world that they attack every year, particularly the Federal Reserve Board that coming in frequently. So here we have a very early instance in 1983 of a governor speaking up in favor of the institution not being deliberate. That I think is one thing. I won't. There are a few others, but I don't have time, so I won't go on and on. Uh, I know that he was deeply concerned with ensuring that the management of the exchange rate should show excellence. I mentioned in his book Export uh, Prospects of India and so on, Trends and Prospects, that he felt that we were getting locked into strong an exchange rate, which is actually bad for exports. It helps import substitution is bad. And he felt that that was right. So I was myself engaged in various discussions today from the finance ministry. I've been in the finance ministry. How can we moderate the system of exchange rate management, which would give the Reserve Bank a little more flexibility to adjust the exchange rate to counter the tendency for real effective exchange rate appreciation? And those were very important initiatives. I mean, he initiated from the Reserve Bank of India, and we took the necessary actions in the finance ministry, got the approval, etc. None of this was announced too much in public, but it's, if you like, one below the surface. It creates an awareness that this is something that we should worry about. So I think he was fully aware of this. That is Manmohan Singh as finance minister. Now let's move to his role as civil servant. Now let me move to his role as finance. This was no doubt the period when he made this deal. I mean, he had a wonderful run as civil servant, but as finance minister, I think he made it. And this is because he was called in to handle a crisis of unprecedented severity. But he didn't just handle the crisis, like what have been done relatively easily. He used it as an opportunity to start a process of reforms that were long overdue. In fact, he had asked for it in 1971, and which helped to change India's growth trajectory. So he had a terrific opportunity handed to it, and he used it. The 1991 reforms, in my view, represented a fundamental shift away from highly restricted economic policies which were rooted in Congress party's thinking after independence. These policies should have evolved in line with what was happening in the rest of the world, but they did not. And as we have seen, Manmohan Singh tried to change the direction in 1971, but they did go very far. Importantly, even in 1991, although the changes that were being made were foundational in my view, the extent of the change was deliberately understated. I mean, the approach was, no, there's nothing unusual. We keep announcing new policies. This is yet another policy. No, this is obviously because it was the same. I mean, a Congress government under Narasimha Rao cannot easily get up and say that I'm now junking what the earlier Congress governments thought was a good policy. So personally, I think more people should have said that you are junking. Because I think, one must tell the truth. I mean, the truth has a great value. Because that's the only way people learn. But I mean, we shout everything in government in a way in which the truth doesn't come out. So I think that the political messaging was designed for the fact that the Congress government would not want to criticize policies introduced by earlier Congress governments. Now, it's interesting if you look back. The need for a break from the past had in effect been signaled even at the political level by Rajiv Gandhi as Prime Minister way back in 1985. I mean, he thought to take India to the 21st century, which is sort of
visionary kind of kid, just like we now have Vixit Bharat. No, think Walter, youth were very excited. But he went further also, that in Parliament, he said, and I'm going to quote, he said, how can we compete with other nations if we are working with systems that are 20 years out of date? That's a pretty strong statement of a prime minister. Other prime ministers had said in the past that, our economic performance is not what it should be, something wrong. And the general approach was, oh, you should implement a better, etc. This is the first time that the prime minister said the system is wrong. Now, the solution, therefore, is to change the system. And that did not actually happen. Now, I recounted in my book Backstage, which Mishaji mentioned earlier. There was a conversation between Rajiv Gandhi and LK Chao. And Rajiv Gandhi started to make some changes. But, they were small changes. I see Sujit Bhalla there. I think he's the one who coined the term tickerization. Others were more polite and they said incremental reform. That's what it was, really. Little change. A good thing, but not what Rajiv Gandhi talked about, not a system change. And Rajiv asked LK Chao that, we're making all these liberalization moves. But why is the economy not responding the way I wanted it to? And LK Chao's response was memorable. He said, sir, the Indian economy is like a calf with many brakes all fully pressed on. Unless we remove all or most of them, it won't move. And this is really a very, very important thing. I'm saying this because LK Chao was an economic advisor to the Prime Minister in the mid-80s. So it's not as if what we did was new. It was happening. But I think there's something about the culture of the way we think about policies that we do not bring them out into the maybe, I don't know, I don't know whether you want to call it a cultural trait or not. I would not like to call it a cultural trait. But whatever it is, we need to change. And what I'm trying to show is that these thoughts were there, but somehow the system didn't let them surface. We needed his system change. It didn't happen. And frankly, only sensible economic historians should go into this. I mean, you need to go into different people's memoirs or what did they say, etc. I've done my own guess. But I've said what I have to say in that state. But this is something we should go into, primarily to learn lessons for the future. I mean, we are entering into a very uncertain world in the future. And whenever you enter into an uncertain world, there are choices. We are not seeing an adequate exploration of alternatives. And I really feel that our past indicates that failure to do that at the right time just led to a delay, which was not particularly good for the economy. I don't want to go on and on, but I think one of the points is that we had a crisis. It had a wrong build-up. I mean, problems surfaced by the end of 1980s. Rajiv Gandhi was told that, listen, there's a balance of payments problem is coming up. We are financing the balance of payments by not pulling down reserves. We can do that for a while. But after a while, you have to take some corrective steps. At that point, the elections were due in 1989. And he said that the impact over me, I was in his office, that after the elections, please remind me about this and we must do something. Well, he lost the election. And what came in was a pretty shaky coalition with VP Singh. We remembered our instructions, and for some reason, VP Singh continued, both my boss, E.G. Deshmukh, and me, in the same office. And in fact, this was a bit of a surprise. And this is a lovely story which I have to tell. I once was sitting outside Rajiv Gandhi's office with B.G. Deshmukh. And I said to him, sir, isn't it very odd that we were in the previous Prime Minister's office and normally when a Prime Minister changes, it's normal. You get posted cover, some new chats come. But VP Singh is continuing us both. Now, of course, he was earlier a congressman, so he knew some of us, etc. But I think B.G. Deshmukh's answer was really worth putting down. If you will allow me, I'll put it in the actual text also. He said, देखो बनते, दिल्ली ऐसा शहर है जहां कप बदलते हैं लेकिन चमचे नहीं बदलते. I mean, the senior most civil servant in the system telling his junior, making a joke of the senior civil servant. He was a remarkable guy, by the way, and I owe a lot to him. And he was I think one of the interesting things about him is that he came from Bombay. And that meant he was much more naturally pro-private sector. And all the other cabinet secretaries that have come from North India or even deep in South India, they were much more into the public sector more and not merely pro-private sector. B.G. Deshmukh, on the other hand, was very strongly pro-private sector. So you see how these things, I think there are these differences in any government, and I think we should encourage them to serve us. I mean, sometimes I wonder whether you can't understand why Manmohan Singh was able to do what he did unless you realize how serious the crisis was. And my guess is that most people do not know how serious the crisis was. I did a little calculation that you would assume that if nobody who is younger than the age of 12 would have any personal recollection of the crisis. So in 1991, if somebody was 12 years old in 1991, my calculation suggests that they would now be about 36 years old today, or something like that. Do you see it? No, sorry, 46 years. So the question I want to pose, I want to know how many people in the audience here are below the age of 46. Those below the age of 46, please raise your hand. That's pretty large. So, I mean, a lot of you have no personal recollection. Therefore, I think I want to just describe what happened, primarily so that you can see that if we ever repeat this, thank God we are not repeating it, and we're not in a crisis. But you never know where a crisis happens. If you ever see this kind of thing, you should be aware that this is a mess. One, I mentioned that there were early signs of trouble. The DP Singh came in. He wasn't able to take any action. In fact, at that time, people said, look, sir, Finance Ministry, Reserve Bank, you should go to the IMF because you get a lot of money, you get some time to make some corrective action, we'll handle it. DP didn't want to do that because, going to the IMF, politically difficult, replicate difficult action. He called me in. I was still one of the chamchas in his office. He called me in and said, Khanding, you really think we have to go to the IMF? Can I not do without going to the IMF? So I said, of course you can do without going to the IMF. The only thing is, if you don't go to the IMF, you have to do what the IMF wants to do anyway, except you have to do more. Because what the IMF does is gives you more money so you can stretch out your adjustment. If you don't have the money, you have to do the adjustment faster. Therefore, you have to do more of all the reasons why you don't want to go to the IMF. He thought about that. He didn't contradict me, but he didn't do anything anyway. And then we have Chandrasekhar, and it was very unstable. The election took place. Congress fought the election. Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated in the middle of the election. Slight sort of turmoil, but the election went on, and the new government came in, and the new government brought in Narasimha Rao as the prime minister. And the cabinet secretary at the time was Naresh Chandra, very fine civil servant, for whom I have the highest regard. And Naresh was very frank with he told me, I wasn't there. He told me I was very frank with him, and I said, look, this is a mess. If you don't do something, you may default on our payments, and you better bring in a technocrat as finance minister, because you got to understand the thing. You got to be credible internationally. You got to persuade financial people, etc. In a way, it doesn't matter who you are, a finance minister, as the economy is doing well. The real problem is it is not doing well. That whatever you say is going to be looked at very, very closely. So whoever has that awful job must somehow look credible. He looked at things the choice fell on Manmohan Singh. And when Narasimha Rao offered the job to Manmohan Singh, Manmohan himself told me later that I said to him, look, I can do this. But if you want me to do this, I have to take a rather politically unpopular decisions. And that will be difficult for you. And Narasimha Rao said to him, you do what you have to do, lead the politics. And they added, if you succeed, you share the credit. You say, you get the credit. So it's a pretty, and Manmohan also got a pretty fair arrangement. And, well, he took it. This, what he had to do was to try and manage the system. It had really become a complete mess because as the reserves ran down, they were managing the system through administrative controls. This, for you younger people, you should watch out. The more administrative controls are used, the worse your future is going to be. I have no doubt about it. Because what these guys were doing at the time, and this is now during the Chandrasekhar government, the very early parts of the Congress government, the Reserve Bank said, we don't have money. So even if somebody has an import license, a valid import license to bring in imports, you're an exporter, you have a valid import license to bring in inputs that you need for exports, it has to be clear. Everything above, I forget, 1 crore or something like that, had to be cleared in the finance ministry. That means paperwork, file, this, that, administration is sitting at the top. Exporters would come, I was then Commerce Secretary. Exporters would come to me and say, look, if you give me $1 million of foreign exchange, I can guarantee $4 million export earnings 5 months later. But you're not giving me the inputs, so you won't get the exports. I think this was an example of, what Manmohan himself had pointed out. We should have relied much more on a flexible exchange rate. We wouldn't have to do this kind of thing if we had. But anyway, this was one of the things that was done in the reforms. Now, I don't want to, it would take too long for me to say everything that we did, or rather that Manmohan Singh did in the reforms, but it was a pretty big kind of package. And I think I just want to mention the totality of the package by just listing these, just to see that in a very short time, actual action took place in all these areas. That's what I think a serious reform program is. And these were the following. 1, liberalizing industrial policy. 2, reducing the area reserved for public sector. 3, liberalizing FDI policy. 4, reducing reliance on import licensing and lowering import duties while relying on a flexible exchange rate. Liberalizing the capital market with regulation done by SEBI, opening the economy to portfolio flows in a phased manner, and liberalizing the banking and the financial sector. So, actually, within a few months, it would have been possible to put out a little advertisement saying, not that we are talking about these things, but that this is what we've actually done. Now, when you do other things, you may not get the details right. Nobody can actually, you never know how an economy is going to respond. But I think it is much better to get it done and keep a watchful eye and have a watchful ear so that unintended consequences you hear about and then you correct. It's very important to do that. I think in that sense, I would say that one of the things of the last couple of years, which the present government did, which is very commendable, is that, there was an effort that at one stage there was an announcement that all laptop imports are going to be licensed. A huge human right, and this was quickly reversed. I can tell you that within the bureaucracy, whoever did the licensing would have hated the reversal. But I'm really glad that the reversal took place. You need systems where somebody can create a flag and say, oops, got it wrong. And there should be no hesitation to recognize because mistakes will be made. Okay? Um, at the time, many people criticized the reforms, saying that all this is being done at the behest of the World Bank and the IMF. I don't know what we would do without the World Bank and the IMF. We had nobody to blame. So they serve an extremely important national purpose, actually. And I hope they realize it. But the fact is, this was not true. I think it's true that these institutions would not have lent us money if we had not done reforms. But the reforms they would insist on were very few, and they were difficult, but they were not controversial, except the devaluation. I think we did much more than what these fellows would have insisted needs to be done. And that, I think, is the wisdom. Because if the approach was, they're not asking for it, let's not do it. In fact, the approach was, here we have an opportunity, let's do it. And I think that paid off very well. And in a way, that is what, for example, some people criticize the government, that, the US is acting tough on tariffs. We should all act tough on tariffs. I don't think that's actually correct. In fact, what we are doing, which is trying to sign FTA, is a very good thing. Although some people do feel that that's not the right thing, I think it's the right thing. So, the way you design your policy, there will always be differences. And the best thing to do is encourage people to raise those differences and discuss. I think I want to just mention one thing that in 1990, I had written a paper for VP Singh, which recommended a whole lot of changes, which were pretty similar to what we actually did in 1991. And that leaked. I had a huge debate in the press, etc. And the debate was very good because the debate showed that while some people are opposed to it, there were a lot of people in favor. And Ashok Desai, who is a journalist, later on became a colleague, he wrote a piece in one of the newspapers, and he said, and he's the one who called it the end document. Well, he said, we know it's written by Montek Ahluwalia, he's not getting it, let's just call it the end document. He said that, look, he read it, he said, it's not bad at all. And he said, maybe the government should leak its internal papers more often because it would give people a sense that people are thinking and discussing. I don't know how that could be done, but it is true that it would reduce the secrecy phenomenon. I think many factors came into play when the reforms were urged. And I think they all had relevance to the later period when he was prime minister and also to understanding how change is made. One of the things is that he was uniquely suited to persuading the public to accept the need for policy change. He was not a great, or I would say even a good orator. And he was not someone who would be able to whip up a crowd with enthusiasm. But he was terrific, if you like, interlocutor in a serious, technical, high-level discussion. And he had many such opportunities. He gave many press conferences, responding to criticism one by one. And I thought that kind of thing helped the country to understand why we need to change. Because at that time, there wasn't even that realizing. And then I think Mishraji made a very important point when he said that, his personal austerity, he said personal austerity helped. Yes, right. Because, I think liberalizing, and liberalizing is generally seen to be an upper middle class, rich person's desire. So why the hell are we having to drive ambassadors and Fiats where you could import whatever it is, And similar things all around the line. I think he was able to liberalize a lot of things precisely because his personal lifestyle was so austere, if you ask me, excessively austere, that nobody could blame him having a vested interest in doing that. The the person who captured this best to me was Arvind Hussain, who was then our ambassador in the United States, an early civil servant and a liberalizer. And he knew both me and my wife, Isha. And he knew that she liked sinning. So he said, "Bhai, I just read the budget speech of the finance minister. He's done a terrific job because he himself wanted this kind of thing." He says, "Will you do me a favor? Just go to his house and sing him the following." And then he sang, "Sabarmati ke sam tune kar diya kamal." It was a very good invocation of sort of saintly austerity, but then combined with the ability to liberalize. Let me give you another example, which I think will give you a sense of how these discussions played out. At that time, we were working very hard to ensure that the banks, public sector banks, took to computerization. I mean, private banks were computerizing, foreign banks were computerizing, and in the public sector, banks didn't computerize, they just would have voted each other. But the bank unions, and there were many unions, Congress Party unions, BJP unions, every other party, Communist Party unions, were all totally opposed to this. So Manmohan Singh decided to invite each of them, the leaders of each of these unions, 8 or 9 unions, to his office. And he had a discussion with them. So the discussion did not lead to any kind of agreement. None of them changed their mind. All of them felt computerization should not be done. It will lead to lower employment, etc., etc. But I felt that the discussion made them think. And then, since he was polite to a point, and he went at the end of the meeting, instead of just going to his desk, he went to the door of his room and shook hands with each union leader as they went down. I think this touched them a bit. And one of them, who was actually the most aggressive, he sort of said as he was leaving, "Mr. Finance Minister, I completely disagree with you on computerizing bank unions. But I don't mind admitting that my son agrees with you." I think it was a recognition that people may take us up to a position, but you also know that the world is changing. The kids are changing. So I think what he was saying is, look, I've got to do my dharma, you're going to do yours. We don't necessarily expect them to agree with you. I think this is an important thing that, in a democracy, you cannot expect consensus. But what you can expect is a saucering of opposition. And what debate and discussion and sulwai and all that kind of thing does is it softens the opposition. The people are a little more willing to give it a chance. And there, I think his personal integrity, people were convinced that, look, maybe he's wrong, but he really believes it. Nobody thought he was pulling the bull. Nobody thought he was saying something to you which is different from what he would be saying to someone else. That is really what I think, when I think back on it, making this change was a very big step. And I think he was able to persuade the intellectual class that that change is actually desirable. I think one of the things he did, it is as a result of this, that the degree of consensus in pervading the political parties expand. And successor governments, Devagowda, Hindu Gujarat government, National Front, Vajpayee government later on, they more or less continue these same policies. And I think that contribution is very important. I mean, in a democracy, parties are going to oppose each other strongly. I mean, no party wants to say what you're doing is right. I mean, that's not the job of the opposition. But the system must work in such a way that these differences, when they are played out, in the end, when you come to government, you don't necessarily reverse what has happened. And I think you see that even today, I would argue that quite a lot of what is happening in the India today is a continuation of what was done in UPA. You can argue with it. Some will argue that they're doing it better. That's not important. The important thing is not a reversal. I'll get back to that in a little while. Okay? Well, I have five. How much time you want me? I mean, I'm just enjoying this so much. Okay. I want to give one more example of how Dr. Singh operated, which I think is a human thing. I mean, he was very conscious about building a team. And he also recognized that in building a team, you don't just fill it with people who simply replicate what you say. Team, to be credible, a team must share a common goal. But, they go to this goal from different points of view. This has the advantage that somebody outside looking at your team feels that this fellow will understand my point better, so let me go and approach him. And I think he called a bunch of the secretaries, all the economic secretaries were called, I would also call him, finance minister. And he said, look, we're going to make big changes. And I want your support. Without your support, it won't work. I want your support. Please think hard about it. If you have a problem with something we're doing, come and tell me, and I'm willing to discuss it with you. If there's a problem that which we are missing, come and tell me, and we can discuss that. But please don't obstruct things just because you don't like the policy. And then even further, and this is very important because, by the way, in government, the one power that the bureaucracy has is to obstruct. They are appearing to obstruct. In the finance ministry, the joke used to be that you want to delay something for 2 months. All you have to do is note on the file, the views of the Reserve Bank may kindly be obtained. Or may take care of it for at least 2 months. But what Manmohan was saying was, look, I know these things. I want you to help. If you really can't help, if you really disagree with me, and this was something he said, let me know and I'll give you another job which is equally good, if not that. So I think this business of, I certainly felt when I was part of his team, it was not a hierarchical team. All the people sort of had access to him, had worked with him, and they knew that if they disagreed with each other, and we had many differences internally, which were quite satisfactorily resolved. Building a team is, in my view, a very important thing if we want to get a lot of stuff done. So that is one part of the story. And I do feel that the question arises, did the reforms succeed? At the end of his budget speech, Manmohan Singh quoted Victor Hugo, "No army on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. And the idea of India as an economic power is one such idea." Next 10 years vindicated this particular prediction. India was included in the Goldman Sachs analysis, which identified a handful of developing countries that would fuel the growth of the world economy. And this group, with the addition of South Africa, is what we now call BRICS. Of course, many other countries have joined, so BRICS will become a much bigger thing. Now, let me turn to the third part of Dr. Manmohan Singh's career, and that was when he became Prime Minister. My wife, Isha Lai, wrote oath in Washington, D.C., when this announcement came that he's going to be the next Prime Minister. Naturally, we were all delighted. You were delighted, both of us. And it's interesting how one's different identities begin to surface. Because we said, well, the first time a friend has become Prime Minister, that's quite nice. The first time an economist had become Prime Minister, that's another lady. He's the second Punjabi Prime Minister, like Inder Gujral was the first. And he's the first Sikh Prime Minister. And Isha had taught in Khalsa College. I had never taught. And she said, Annie, the first professor to become Prime Minister. So different identities leading to different reasons for reacting well. Anyway, I was aware that I was delighted that he called me back. Of course, I did hear and so on. I was very aware that the circumstances would be quite different. I don't think that he could have expected to, in under any circumstances, he could have expected to make a comparable transformational difference in his second period than in the first, because the first period was foundational and was still going on. And frankly, what he had to do was to make sure that that change continued. That was a big enough task, and not a kind of, and now for my next miracle, I'm going to do something else. And I think that was really the message that he himself understood. But I think you have to understand the politics, which was completely different. National Rao did not have a coalition government, he had a minority government. And he had a pretty large chunk of votes. And I think he had 245 seats. You need about 275. So the extra bits could always be made up with some small part. This one was actually a coalition. I mean, the Congress Party, let me just give you the numbers. The Congress Party had only 145 seats. With their allies, that is the UPA, they had 218. You need 275 to have a majority. It's only to include the left, which had about 59 seats, that these guys would have had 277. So action in that government could not be just a Congress Party affair. It had to be keeping the allies together, keeping the left hand. Not an easy thing to do at all. And of course, within the system, and the division between the Prime Minister and Mr. Gandhi, that was also unavoidable because he was not the leader of the Congress Party. She had led the Congress Party. So that would have some arrangement. One can argue whether it was a good arrangement or what a good arrangement, but it was clearly a sort of a Kitchery type governments, which was quite a miracle that they stayed together for 5 years. I mean, that is the important thing. Now, what can you do in such a situation? I mean, he was very aware that there are multiple constraints on him as Prime Minister. And of course, he would call this the constraints of coalition politics. But actually, it was much more than coalition politics. That was an understatement. I think that if you sit back and ask yourself, what did Manmohan Singh achieve as Prime Minister? And it's quite clear that in UPA 1, there were very substantial achievements. In UPA 2, towards the last 3 years, they ran into problems. That happens. But let me just go over, if you take the 10 years together, what does it look like? The one important thing was retaining a focus on economic growth. You know, the 2004 election, Bappaji had gone to the electorate on the slogan Shiny India, and they lost. So on the left, and also all the NGOs, they're very keen that we should downplay all this growth. It doesn't work, it's not a good thing. Manmohan Singh was quite aware that this would not be the right thing, because growth is not sufficient, but he knew that it was necessary. I mean, without growth, none of the other good things would happen. So we needed to retain some focus on growth. Unfortunately, the National Common Minimum Program was drafted. Now, you may think that drafting is not important, but actually, the left have categorically said, we will support you only as long as you are following the National Common Minimum Program. And the most important thing about the NCMP is it also said we should encourage private sector in this area. This was actually the critical thing because the government didn't have the money to do all this infrastructure in Pakistan. Definitely not. So the fact that the NCMP said, and you should bring in the private sector, enabled us to put forward different kinds of public-private participation schemes. And Manmohan Singh himself led that process quite a bit. I should actually mention that one of my colleagues in the Planning Commission, we set up a special cell on how to push the private sector And one of my colleagues was Gajendra Haldia, the late Gajendra Haldia. He did outstanding job in creating a framework in which you could have private sector investments without the accusation of cronyism. You know, the Visium Hall, which was just opened 2 years ago, up in Manila, and is now being expanded, were all done by on the basis that the Hadia was plugging. And even though it was a single bid, and there was a lot of criticism that often Mr. Adani put in the bid because the legitimate bid, people said it's a single bid. And Vijay pointed out that the rules do not require you not to accept a single bid if it is otherwise okay. And at that time, it was very controversial. But now you have a fantastic port that is in operation and is actually expanding. So, I mean, they've already started the expansion. This is the difference between public sector and private sector. If it had been a public sector port and it had worked, it wouldn't have been expanded for 10 years and quite close. Okay? So that I think is an important area. And I think there, a lot of what was started during UPA have been continued and even accelerated, which is good. The NCNP also said we must expand FDR. And this was an important signal because the left, both the left and sections of the right, kind of little ambiguous about FDR. But here was a clear statement that it said we must raise FDR to between 2 and 3 times the present levels. So it gave a clear target of what we want to reach. And we did try to do that. I don't think we did achieve a lot in portfolio flow, not so much in FDR. I think we need to look at why that's still a problem. FDI is not rising nearly as much as people think, and we need to examine why. But the signal of legitimizing it was certainly there. I think one of the big mistakes we didn't do, we didn't reduce import duties the way we should. I mean, it was Dr. Manmohan Singh who started the duty reduction process. The United Front continued it. The Vajpayee government also continued it. But somehow the UPA failed to continue. I'm not sure exactly why, but I think that we would have been better off if they had also continued the reduction. But they didn't. I think one area of criticism always here is that what about education? What about health? Amartya Sen, great friend of Dr. Singh, he was a very eloquent critic that India is not doing enough on health. He's right. Money was being given, but I think it's now beginning to be realized that it's not money alone. You need state capacity. And secondly, these are areas for the state governments to put money, not the central government. So, and that problem still remains. We don't know how we're going to handle this. But one of the things that Manmohan Singh always said is that if you're talking about health and education, it takes a long time for results to surface. Because, you start improving your education, take about 10, 12 years if you got it right before the more educated, better educated people start coming into the labor force. So time is a relevant factor. I think it'll be interesting to see whether the next 10 years shows this group. There are a lot of people who are doing very good work on this these days, and I keep hearing mixed pictures. I find a lot of people tell me that at the micro level, there are lots and lots of very good stories, but not as the aggregate. So what is necessary to scale up micro successes to aggregate successes is the challenge. I want to mention just 2 other things, and I'll do it very, very quickly. One is obviously the Indo-US nuclear deal. But it's so complicated that other than saying that it was very important, that it was Manmohan Singh who took the lead in that, it was the US that opened the door because Condi Rice persuaded George Bush that we should give the Indians an option. He faced huge opposition within the country. Congress party didn't like it because historically, the big Bangladesh incidents and the nuclear carrier coming up, etc. Left didn't like it. Even the BJP didn't like it. But I think they managed to bring all these people together And after a lot of very complex negotiations, this was all done. The only point I want to make is that it is wrong to feel that the test of whether the nuclear deal is a success is whether we have nuclear reactors. That would be a possibility. Actually, the nuclear deal was a precondition for a lot of other cooperation in defense and security. If we had not done the nuclear deal, none of the defense cooperation that is now taking place, which in my view is a good thing between India and the United States, would have been possible. So it was like building of laying a ground floor on which a whole edifice could happily go. And I think that frankly it was quite a masterly action by him. At the very end, it actually led to him offering Mrs. Gandhi his resignation because she was under a lot of. I said all this at backstage, so those of you that want the detail have read it there. But the bottom line was that the left actually said that we will walk out of this government if you proceed with the nuclear. It wasn't clear why, by the way, just a kind of knee-jerk opposition to the US. And I mean, obviously, she had a legitimate concern that, look, I mean, if the government falls, then surely you don't want that. But many good things we can do. Party would not be happy either. But he persuaded her that she should allow him to do this. The left threatened a vote of no confidence. He finessed that by seeking a vote of confidence on the nuclear deal, which is very different from vote of no confidence. The left voted against it, but he was able to mobilize the Samajwadi Party, for which he actually got help from President Kalam, who spoke to Manmohan Singh ji, etc. So, I mean, a lot of political manipulation by someone who generally wasn't viewed as a politician. I think the Indo-US nuclear deal established that he knew how to move politics when he thought was really necessary. And I think it's still not appropriately appreciated. And actually, now that climate change is there and people are talking about nuclear power, we are signing all sorts of, not signing, but we're talking about small modular reactors. Now, unless we intend only to use Indian technology, which would be a huge mistake, because small modular reactor technology is going to spread. And I think we need to bring in foreign technology against which Indian technology can compete. None of this would have been possible if the nuclear deal had not been signed. So let's see what happens. But I think that augurs well. And finally, Aadhaar. I think one of the big successes of UPA, in UPA 2 actually, the nuclear deal was in UPA 1, Aadhaar is UPA 2. It has produced the, if you like, the basic platform on which the whole digital stack is being built and on which the whole inclusion, financial inclusion can take place. I want to say that, the critical thing here was not that we decided on Aadhaar. The critical thing here was that we brought in Nandan Nilekani. And I think somebody should do a case study that would it have been different if Nandan had not come in? I think we would not. We would have been stuck in a completely old-fashioned way of doing Aadhaar. He turned the whole thing upside down. I mean, this deserves a whole separate lecture. But I won't bother you. I just tantalize you. Read about it. I think Nandan said, look, originally Dr. Manmohan Singh said, look, we need to get Nandan in. So what about bringing him into the panel commission? I said, wonderful. And he said, you go and talk to him. So I talked to Nandan and I said, look, you choose whatever you want. You can be member whatever you like. He said, I don't want this. Member this is. I don't want to be talking to other bureaucrats. If you got something which I can take charge of and do, like a business, just my task, and you give me autonomy, then I want to take up Aadhaar. So I said, wonderful, we'll do that. And I suggested to Dr. Singh that, look, give him cabinet rank. But what is cabinet rank? But it has some mystical appeal to bureaucrats. But by the way, it doesn't necessarily stop them from being obstructive. But they call you sir, and they're willing to come to your room rather than you having to go to their room, that kind. I mean, somebody, I told him, I told my guy, I said, look, he's located in the planning commission. Please don't put any obstructions in this park. But I have told Dr. Singh that when there's a difference between anyone in the planning commission and Nandal, I'm going to support Nandal without going into the detail, because that's the equivalent to making it really autonomous. And it's interesting that I think in future, you dealing with very complex things, AI, cybersecurity, and all sorts of things that certainly my grandson knows more about them than I do, by the way. And I keep checking a few things with him, and I'm impressed by how much he knows. This cannot be done in a normal way. We should bring in more younger people from outside. And I think someone should do a case study on experience on Nandan Nilapay and his induction, because he succeeded. And I will just tell you one bit and then I'll stop. Nandan said, look, you fellows don't have technical skills in civil service, and I need to bring in people from outside. So I said, look, I agree with you. If you find you can't get someone within the civil service, we will allow you to bring in outside. And he brought in some. But he told me that I know a lot of guys who are actually NDAs in computer science, and they took the IS exam, joined the IS, and they're very keen to work with me. But if you advertise this within the Department of Personnel, they'll never move that, because they'll say, no, he's already done this here, he's not ready, etc. So what he said is, look, I will find IS officers who are really competent. You just exempt personnel department's clearance only. So I said, fine, you find me the guy and we will do that. And we did that. And by the way, some of his top people are IAS officers. One of them, Sharma, was actually deputy secretary in finance ministry when I was secretary. And I didn't even know that he had an MA in computer science. I'd have been much more respectful so I'd known him. So, I think we underestimate the fact. I'm not making any comment about today. I'm making a comment about the UPA and before. We underestimate the fact that we are not using the human resources we have anything like in a reasonable way. Now, what to do about it is another matter. But I think it's something that whoever tackles this will have tackled half the problem of getting to Viksit Bharat. And by the way, if we don't tackle it, we won't get there. So that is really, these are not typical reforms by your duty, your tax rate. These are big institutional changes. And elsewhere in the world, there will be revolutions in how administration, administrative systems are organized. We have not yet had that. Well, it's been great saying all this. I've got more, but I don't want to read the lecture when they put it on the website. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.